So, what is Ebola up to again? Deadly Ebola is intensifying in Congo, and new warnings also concern travel to Uganda and South Sudan. And besides that, we have another even more serious report here, namely that an American named Americans suspected of having Ebola will be arriving in Prague tonight. Yes, a person infected with Ebola will be arriving in Prague. He is a doctor who, of course, had contact with Ebola. And in Africa, the epidemic of this disease is spreading again. What is Ebola? I think you've probably come across this name quite often in the past, but let's go over it again for you younger ones who are probably panicking now that there's another pandemic, some terrible disease. So to make you even more scared, I'll describe to you how Ebola manifests itself. Ebola manifests itself by making you completely lose control over your bowels and over your excretion. You have a brutal fever, you sweat profusely, everything is just pouring out of you from everywhere, basically from all your openings, blood, excretions, and water just flow out. You often die from dehydration and horrible and terrible pain. That's essentially how Ebola presents. Otherwise, Ebola is a viral disease, which means that regular medicines and antibiotics don't work against it. Antivirals have to be used, and the best form of prevention against Ebola is vaccination. Of course, as with any disease for which there is a vaccine, the best form of prevention is vaccination. We're not having this discussion. However, why is Ebola spreading in Uganda, and is there any danger to the Czech Republic from a patient flying to Prague? Should we stop him simply at the border? And preferably just send him to the eternal hunting grounds so he can't spread this terrible disease any further? So first of all, it's important to understand how Ebola spreads. Ebola doesn't spread by an infected person getting on a bus with you and coughing in your face. That's how COVID spreads. That's how the flu spreads. But Ebola spreads in such a way that a person who is infected is completely unable to take care of themselves. Of course, as we said, everything is coming out of them. They're just vomiting, having diarrhea, everything. And so they're often being cared for at home or in some local hospital in Africa where they don't have enough protective equipment like gloves, gowns, boots, masks, all these things, goggles, and so on, right? And then this person, as they're spreading all their bodily fluids around, those fluids can, of course, get into someone else's wound on their hand or into their eyes or into their mouth, theoretically. Anything can happen, things splash and so on. It's a disgusting, disgusting thought. Of course, being a doctor is a terrible thing. In any case, this bodily fluid, contact with blood and so on, can somehow get into your body. And at that moment, you are infected with Ebola, right? You know? A huge advantage compared to things like the coronavirus is that Ebola is really a very brutal disease, and you simply aren't able to get on a bus with it, right? You aren't able to do anything. Someone has to take care of you. So even if you wanted to 100 times, you simply can't go outside and spread your bodily fluids everywhere and so on and so forth. Yeah, for example, it can happen that a person who is newly infected and hasn't fully shown symptoms yet might leave the disease somewhere, I don't know, on public toilets or somewhere like that, and then someone else might touch it. But that's more or less unlikely. Much more common is transmission from a person who is already sick to someone who is directly taking care of them and is in direct contact with their body and so on, right? And that's why this disease spreads so easily in Africa, because first of all, there isn't enough vaccination. And secondly, the hospitals aren't sophisticated enough. And often the person doesn't even get to a hospital because they're being cared for by their own relatives in some remote village or small town. Of course, when a person with Ebola gets to a hospital in a big capital city in Uganda or Sudan, those cities are fairly modern, or rather, they're modern cities. They have modern hospitals, they have educated doctors. And at that point, when someone with Ebola gets to such a hospital, they are taken care of absolutely fine. They receive proper care, which further prevents the disease from spreading to the doctor, the nurse, and so on. But the disease can often spread in those remote villages, or from a patient to a doctor who, for example, comes to that remote village, tries to take care of the people there, give them medicine and so on. but doesn't have a perfectly sterile environment, doesn't have perfect protective equipment, and at that moment, the person can simply get infected. And if such a person then travels out of the country where the outbreak is happening to the Czech Republic, what happens then? Once we know this person exists, we isolate them in the hospital, give them all available medicine, and hope they survive. We care for them, and since everyone nearby wears protective gear, the risk of spreading infection is almost eliminated. The chance of anyone else getting infected is about 0.1% or less. Someone taking care of an Ebola patient in a hospital in the Czech Republic could get infected. So basically, you could say that in the Czech Republic or in Europe with a functioning healthcare system where you end up in the hospital even with a simple flu if it gets a bit serious, and where hygiene regulations and these things are perfectly followed everywhere, a hygienic pandemic of Ebola is absolutely and totally out of the question. Just as a pandemic or epidemic of any virus or bacterial disease that is transmitted by blood or simply by bodily fluids, or by having sex with that person or something like that is out of the question. If there is a disease that manifests itself so brutally, like you are shitting your own blood, and at the same time it is transmitted by having to kiss someone, suck their thumb, or suck whatever else, then in a civilized and modern society, an epidemic of this virus is absolutely impossible. It's a different case, for example, with the HIV virus, which causes AIDS. At that moment, you have a problem because AIDS doesn't really show any obvious symptoms on the outside, especially if you have some kind of treatment that suppresses the symptoms of the disease or successfully reduces them to the smallest possible signs. And if you line up 10 people next to each other and 5 of them have AIDS, most of the time you can't tell who has it and who doesn't because it doesn't really show. And the way AIDS, as the HIV virus and the disease kills, is that it weakens the immune system and then some other illness effectively kills the person. Yeah. So at that moment, of course, if a disease that's transmitted by blood, sexual contact, or whatever else has 0 symptoms or very few outward symptoms, then an epidemic can happen. But an epidemic can't happen if the disease has a 30% mortality rate and manifests as brutally as Ebola does. Of course, you might ask, but Lucas, couldn't this Ebola, this viral disease, somehow mutate? Couldn't it change? Couldn't the virus just start spreading through droplets instead of being transmitted through feces? Or just by coughing, or what do I know? Just by coughing. Nebo co já vím, prostě. Couldn't it just start spreading really easily like the flu or a cold? And yes, it could. Like this mutation could happen. However, for the virus, it's such a drastic change that it's very unlikely. It's much more likely that some virus, which exists only in the world of birds and is transmitted through the air. I mean, it's spread by droplets, like when birds sneeze or similar things. Not that birds fly, and that's why it's through the air. Anyway, never mind. The point is, for Ebola to start spreading through the air, it would just have to mutate way too much. And at that point, it would probably have completely different symptoms because the mutation can't just happen in the way it spreads and keep its original effects. The change in the virus would probably be more complex. Yes, so in this regard, sure, that possibility exists. It's not impossible that the Ebola virus could start spreading simply by sneezing, but it's very, 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 very unlikely. Just like with all other viruses like hantavirus or heptavirus or norovirus or whatever else, which are transmitted through physical contact, really hardcore physical contact, the change to a virus that spreads by sneezing is really highly unlikely. It's not impossible, nothing is impossible in the end, but it's highly unlikely. And as for the overall picture, like Ebola, norovirus, heptavirus, hantavirus, and whatever other viruses, every now and then some new virus appears. some disease. And it seems to me that people always tend to panic because, of course, the media use these viruses as clickbait. Maybe even this video has some kind of magical clickbait that triggered fear in you, and that's why you clicked on it. And this is really something that's caused the panic around these viruses, and the fear of them is caused by irresponsible tabloid journalists. Yeah, if you look at how, for example, the heptavirus outbreak or that virus on the ship was communicated, you know, that first the World Health Organization issued a warning, then parties like BBC, CNN, and so on picked it up. And they reported on it in a relatively scientific, relatively professional way. But then after these big or serious media outlets, the tabloid newspapers picked it up and started writing things like deadly virus, a ghost ship, everyone will die, we're screwed, new COVID. Yeah, and then these so-called journalists actually cause much worse reactions in the population than the virus itself. In other words, it really seems to me that more people were scared to death by Ebola or norovirus or hepatitis virus than people who could actually be skutečně mohli být threatened by the virus. So that's that. And maybe I'd like to appeal to journalists to stop screwing around with their job, that when it comes to journalism, they shouldn't be the Ebola of the journalism world. They just shouldn't be spreading piles of crap into the world. That would be nice. Nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Ebola. There's no threat of a pandemic. There's definitely nothing threatening us in the Czech Republic. As for Africa, of course, it's terrible there, but even Africa is growing. Even Africa is modernizing. Their GDP is rising. There are more doctors. People are getting richer. Hospitals exist. So even in Africa, these problems, when it comes to diseases like Ebola, will get smaller and smaller, and they'll start having more of the classic civilization diseases. And something new will probably emerge there again, because when there are a lot of people in a small place, something new always comes up, or it jumps from animals to people. So some pandemic in the future will probably happen again. Some epidemic will probably happen again, but it won't be an epidemic of Ebola or any virus that manifests drastically and is transmitted through bodily fluids. A world like that probably won't exist anymore. So that's it. Take care, support the content, send some money using the QR code here, write your hatred for clickbait headlines and journalistic hyenas in the comments, and join the streams, because we're moving forward. That's it.